This world seems calm, but there are hidden stories of terrible crimes in many places. For instance, Ronald Dominique, also known as the Bayou Strangler. Although his introverted nature and short fat, he silently killed at least 23 young men. Another one is Joseph Vacher, the French Ripper, who haunted the rural areas of France like a ghost. He killed at least 11 people, employing brutal methods such as throat slitting, strangulation, and even evisceration, removing their internal organs, as if every victim had become part of his bloody game. Thomas Wayne Crump, he is another figure whose story is rarely known, yet his crimes are equally appalling. In a near maniacal manner, he took the lives of 7 people, even including his ex-wife. After being arrested, Thomas remained restless in prison, attempting to cause further trouble and nearly claiming another life. He was born in 1940 in Muncie, Indiana, to an average family. His childhood was a mix of the busy life in the small town and the calm moments, and later, a chance encounter during his teenage years changed the course of his life. 2 boys around his age, Larry Morris and William Wagner, joined him in forming a theft gang. In the mid-1950s, a time of turmoil, they stole one car after another. In 1958, when he was 18, Thomas committed a serious crime for the first time. After a woman had a dispute with his mother, he became angry and wanted revenge. He attempted to kill the woman, though his attack was unsuccessful. A year later, Thomas was accused of stealing 4 different cars within 48 hours. However, such brazen actions, he narrowly escaped imprisonment. In 1960, his life continued to hover on the edge of criminality. That year, he and an accomplice tried to rob a man in the public restroom of a hotel. Although he was arrested by the police for attempted robbery, Thomas cunningly argued that he had merely intended to steal the man's wallet and not commit robbery, so he shouldn't be arbitrarily labeled with such a charge. In the end, he was only convicted of a misdemeanor theft and sentenced to a month in jail. Soon after his release, however, he was convicted again, this time for burglary, and received a suspended jail sentence. In May 1961, an incident happened that demonstrated the extremity of his mental state. At that time, he and one of his friends were cruising the streets in their car when they forcibly dragged a man into their vehicle. Once the car reached a speed of 40 miles per hour, they immediately threw the man out. Later, despite being charged, Thomas brazenly claimed that the man had voluntarily entered the car to hitch a ride, but had suddenly jumped out during the drive. In February 1962, Thomas and 2 accomplices lured a 54-year-old man from a bar to a remote area and robbed him of all his money, totaling $82.70. However, this time, Thomas could not evade the police. They arrested him and successfully secured a conviction. The judge, Ralph Rector, during the sentencing, noted that given Thomas's history of evading prosecution, he had no choice but to sentence him to 1 to 5 years in prison. During his incarceration, Thomas's life was far from easy, but he longed for freedom and dreamed of escaping his confinement. In 1963, he and his cellmate, Robert Lindsay, planned to escape from prison. However, due to the tight supervision by the prison staff, they failed to find an opportunity to break out. Their plan ultimately failed, and Thomas was not released until 1966. That year, he fathered a son with a woman, but the bond of family did not hold Thomas back. Instead, he was charged again with robbing a hotel employee. During his detention by the police, despite his claim of having committed the robbery, there was no evidence to convict him. Soon after, he left his hometown and moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico. On July 13, 1967, he committed a robbery in Albuquerque, during which he nearly killed a clerk. After the robbery, he fled New Mexico in a panic and ended up in Saranac, Michigan. However, when a bartender in Saranac asked to see his ID card, Thomas flew into a rage. This man with an extremely vengeful nature, he tracked down the bartender just a few hours later and stabbed him 10 times with a knife. Fortunately, the wounds were not fatal, and the bartender survived. And Thomas was convicted of attempted murder and sent to a Michigan prison. 10 years later, Thomas reappeared on the streets of Albuquerque. As soon as he was released from prison, he returned to the city. This time, he didn't commit any crimes. Instead, he became a construction worker. Not long after, he took a job at AKFC and quickly rose to become the manager through hard work. It was there that he met Rhonda Higdon, a 16-year-old girl. Rhonda fell in love with Thomas at first sight. In her eyes, Thomas was a mature and kind man, and she had no idea about his violent past. Despite the more than 20-year age difference, love quickly heated up their relationship. They got married and had a child. As time went by, however, their love didn't grow stronger. There were many problems emerged. By July 13th, 1980, Rhonda could no longer bear it and asked Thomas for a divorce. On the surface, Thomas didn't seem to have a strong reaction. He just said that he wanted to see Rhonda one last time and take her out for dinner. Because they had been married for years, so Rhonda agreed to Thomas's request. When they met, she got into Thomas's car as usual, but as soon as she fastened her seatbelt, Thomas drove straight toward the suburbs. The Rio Grande River originates in the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado and flows through New Mexico and Texas, and Thomas took Rhonda to the banks of the Rio Grande River. He first asked her to get out of the car and took out a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and fired 5 shots at her. And then he hid Rhonda's body in a nearby ditch and drove away from the scene. On September 9th, Thomas was hitchhiking on the side of the road while on the run, as the police were tracking his movements. Eventually, a 58-year-old man driving a pickup truck stopped and agreed to give him a ride. However, as soon as Thomas got in the vehicle, he became like a raging animal, slashing the man's throat with a knife, stealing $600 from his wallet, and then driving off in the pickup truck toward Nevada. Fortunately, the man he attacked survived. Soon, Thomas arrived in Las Vegas and found a room in a motel, sharing it with 2 other men. On October 4th, he invited Jody James, a 26-year-old local prostitute, to his room. According to Thomas, after having sex with her, he drowned her in the bathtub, although the subsequent autopsy showed that she had been strangled. The day after Jody's murder, Thomas shot his 2 roommates, but he didn't check on their conditions, which allowed them both to survive. 4 days later, Thomas returned to Albuquerque. On the same day, 78-year-old Irving Plastid, an elderly man from Minnesota, asked Thomas for directions. Then, Thomas let him into the car, claiming he would take him to his destination. However, he drove Irving to the edge of the city, robbed him, and shot him in the chest. Although Irving was still alive at that point, Thomas shot him in the head, killing him. By that time, Thomas had already been wanted by investigators, as he was considered the sole suspect in the 3 murders and other crimes. His crimes were like an unstoppable nightmare, spreading across various cities. His name had become the focus of the police and the subject of public discussion, but he didn't care about any of that. He continued to plunge deeper into a life of crime. On November 16, 1980, in a motel in New Mexico, 2 men engaged in a heated argument, and their shouting drew the attention of those around them. Sensing the situation was escalating, the motel staff called the police, who arrived quickly in an attempt to intervene. However, one of them was Thomas, the killer, so the police unexpectedly arrested him. During interrogation, he confessed to a series of crimes he had committed over the past 5 months. The following year, he was convicted of murdering Rhonda and sentenced to life imprisonment. Several months later, he was again sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Irving. However, while serving his sentence in the New Mexico prison, he committed another crime. At that time, Thomas, along with several other inmates, attacked 3 prison guards. One of the guards, Gerald Magee, a 33-year-old, tragically lost his life in the assault. On June 17, 1982, in the prison kitchen, Thomas was making pumpkin pie with 10-inch shackles on. This was a routine activity in the prison aimed at teaching inmates some basic life skills. However, Thomas had other ideas in mind. While making the pumpkin pie, he took the opportunity to free himself from the shackles. Whether it was due to a lapse in prison management or a cruel twist of fate, he surprisingly managed to escape from prison. Not long after, Thomas reappeared on the streets of Albuquerque. The first thing he did upon arriving was to abandon the stolen car. Then, just as he had done before, he stood by the roadside and hailed a taxi. The driver was a young man, 22-year-old Steve Hewitt. However, as soon as Thomas got into the cab, he pulled out his gun and said to Steve, "I want you to know that I'm Thomas Wayne Crumb." Before he could finish his sentence, he pulled the trigger and fired 2 shots. Miraculously, both bullets grazed Steve's skull without causing any significant harm. Hours later, Thomas hailed another taxi. This time, the driver was a 44-year-old man named Ian Smith. As soon as Thomas got into the car, the same thing happened as a few hours earlier. He pulled out his gun and announced, "I want you to know that I'm Thomas Wayne Crumb." But Smith fought back, and a struggle ensued between the two men. During the fight, Thomas accidentally pulled the trigger and shot himself in the right shoulder. Despite the pain, he managed to fire at Smith, killing him. Weakened by his shoulder wound, Thomas staggered into a nearby motel and collapsed on the floor, crying in agony. Seeing his condition, the motel staff immediately called the police. Within minutes, local officers arrived at the scene and arrested him. Nearby, the police also found the taxi with Smith's life signs fading. Despite the police's attempts to provide first aid, he ultimately died from his gunshot wounds. Meanwhile, Thomas was taken to a hospital in Albuquerque, where he received emergency treatment. In April 1981, Thomas stood in the defendant's dock in the Albuquerque courtroom, facing charges of murder and attempted murder. He chose to plead guilty. In the end, the judge sentenced him to 62 years in prison, in addition to 2 life sentences. Soon after, he was extradited to Nevada, where he still had to stand trial for Jody's murder. During the trial, the prosecutor played a videotape. Thomas admitted to strangling Jody, saying that he was angry because someone had entered his room and taken his money. He said, "I lost control. I had nothing. I told Jody she could go to hell with that money." There's no justification for murder or violence, but in my mind, there is. She deserved it. I don't feel any remorse about it. I could have gotten my money without killing her, but I wanted to kill her. It was an eye for an eye. It was premeditated. I knew I was going to kill her, and I did. After the trial, Thomas was sentenced to death. In May 1984, he was sent to death row, where his life became monotonous and desperate. There, he admitted that he had killed 7 people in his lifetime, including a priest when he was 16. He was originally scheduled to be executed on November 14, 1986, but the execution was postponed. And in 1992, he was charged with attempting to murder another death row inmate, though the inmate survived. While on death row, Thomas repeatedly stated in interviews, he said, "I'm not making excuses. I have no sympathy for the victims or anything I've done. Ask me why. I don't know. I've been searching for that why for years." He also frequently expressed his desire to end his life through lethal injection, but he received multiple stays of execution. It wasn't until 5:15 a.m. on June 22, 2018, that he died in a medical facility at the Northern Nevada Correctional Facility. By that time, more than 30 years have passed since he was sentenced to death.